I was thinking this past week as I read this gospel lesson and reflected on all kinds of subject matter that there really are two kinds of teachers. And having taught myself at one point in life, I can relate to this. There's really two kinds of teachers. There are the teachers in a classroom or some kind of setting that ask students to raise their hands when they have the answer. Right? If you have an answer, raise your hand, which usually means feed back to me what I have told you or what you have read. It is a matter of regurgitation. Tell me the answer. That's one kind of teacher. There's a second kind of teacher that asks students to raise their hands, not when they have an answer, but when they have a question. And that's a whole different thing. Because when you have a question in that kind of environment, a creative, open atmosphere that allows you to break through and to move in directions that you could never anticipate, that's when creativity takes place. That's when discussion happens. Sometimes creative dissonance, not conflict, but creative dissonance where we wrestle with ideas or opinions that we never thought before. And that's a different kind of learning. That's a learning you embrace and not a learning you regurgitate and just provide information back. That's the kind of setting that gives birth to new ideas, medical solutions, technological inventions, and theological values. Do you raise your hand when you have the answer, or do you raise your hand when you have a question? Jesus was the master teacher at the latter. In true rabbinical style, questions were asked of him, and in response, he didn't give pat answers, he gave more questions. He invited those around him to enter into the dialogue, to enter and engage into the thinking and the idea and the creativity of spirituality. I went back and looked, and it's very interesting that if you go through the Gospels, Jesus is asked 183 questions. And he gives direct answers to 3. But in other cases, he responds to questions. So if he's asked 183 questions, he asks in response 340 questions. In a world and in that rabbinical style where you involve and you invite those around you rather than shutting them down or stopping them or just giving them the McDonald's form of thinking, you go to this place, you get a Big Mac, and you go over there and you get a Big Mac, and it's all the same. Jesus doesn't do that. He says, fix your own. In fact, the word for disciple in Greek is the same word as learner. So to be a disciple means to study. It means to learn. And when you engage and you think and you ask questions, you grow. No wonder we are told that where 2 or 3 are gathered, you think about that? 2 or 3, because when 2 or 3 are there, I'm German, so when you have 2 or 3 together, 2 or 3 Germans together, you got 4 opinions. That's the atmosphere where you dialogue and you engage and you get together. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am in the midst of them. There is freedom and faith and learning and growth and maturity to be found in that kind of parrying back and forth. It was Picasso who once said he didn't like computers because computers are really good at giving you the answers but don't ask any questions. Still, we may say, yeah, that's great, but we've all been in situations or relationships where really questions weren't welcome. People made fun of our questions. People squelched us from asking teachers, supervisors, co-workers. They like to give us rules and they like to give us regulations and they like to outline the box, and you don't want to push it or break it or do anything to it. And so one gains information. We are in the information age. Just ask someone. I think doctors will tell you that the internet is the worst thing ever invented because people immediately go to the information age and they think they know their diagnosis. There's a difference between getting information and getting learning and growing and expanding who we are. I mean, if all the answers are fixed, if you can get an answer to anything you want out there, why do we have so many problems? I mean, if it's all done, what's the purpose? But things don't stay the same, do they? You know, one day I was griping a little bit privately or to someone, and they looked at me and said, you know, Keith, always remember that a good portion of what you do in your job is to solve problems. Don't complain about them, solve them, work through them, think about them. And yet I was thinking it's that way for most of us in life, but one of the skills very, very lacking today, and I think our educational system is to blame for it, is we are not teaching people how to critically think. People do not critically think. What we want is to be spoon-fed answers quickly and give me a sound bite that I can latch onto. The critical thinking. Where is the critical thinking? In seminary, I once experienced a situation. I was privileged in seminary to have some pretty big names at the time, big name scholars, and that can be good and that can be bad. But Max Stackhouse, who went to Columbia University to end his career, was my ethics instructor, and Max Stackhouse was rather smart and brilliant and pompous. Those sometimes are not mutually exclusive, right? Anyway, he was lecturing, and the student next to me, who eventually went on to become the dean of admissions at that seminary, so not a dolt, raises his hand to ask a question, and he says, Professor Stackhouse, I know that you have said this, and this is your ethical position and how you've arrived at it, but I was reading so-and-so, and he disagrees. And Stackhouse looked at the student and said, and he is wrong. How do you think the learning went for the rest of the semester? Do you think anybody asked a question, or did you realize at that moment to get through, all you had to do was feed back what he told you? In this week's gospel, there's a lot of learning that needs to take place. Jesus is offering to his disciples the second of 3 predictions of his death. And Mark very clearly and specifically tells us they didn't understand and they were afraid to ask. Now, the part about not understanding, I get. The part about being afraid to ask, I question. Because you can say, well, they're afraid to ask because they didn't want to look foolish in front of Jesus, or they didn't want Jesus to put them down, or they didn't want Jesus to say, well, are you not that bright? You know, what's going on? I don't get that. That's not my kind of Jesus, so I don't get that. I think they were afraid to ask because sometimes when we ask questions, we don't ask questions because we don't want to know the answer. That's the other side of it. You know, when you're going on and there's a big thing there, well, if I ask the question and I get an answer I don't like, it's going to make me move my thinking. It's going to cause me to change my paradigm of life. And Jesus is talking about, if you follow me, I'm going to die. So I'm thinking to myself, well, what's that mean for me? I don't want to know. You know? We get in that box where we don't ask because it's just easier to try to exist without those questions and their supposed answers. You know, some church traditions have done this for years. You know, don't ask questions, just affirm what we tell you. Stay in there, and you know, you go into those places, and when somebody does question or there is a dialogue, those people are pushed outside. They're questioned. Their questions take them outside the fold. And that's why we have so many churches, you know, because if one had the truth, why do we need others? You know? Certainly the message of Jesus' death would not be anything a follower of Christ would wish to hear. I would not want to hear him say, I'm going to die, and if I'm a disciple, that may mean I have to take up my cross and follow you too. But to not ask is to not grow. And if we're not growing, we're dying. It's just a fundamental part of life. Because nothing holds still and nothing goes backwards. The answers we had yesterday may have worked great yesterday, but few hold true forever. But what's particularly unsettling about this text, I want you to think about, Jesus catches them. What's the other reason? Well, how is their response to this dialogue that's going on? Jesus is talking about dying, and they don't want to know anything about that, but then he says, what are you talking about? How are they avoiding his questions or this whole conversation? They're talking about themselves. They want to know, Jesus, we're not really so interested in that dying stuff. We want to know what all this following is going to get us. Where's it going to take us? Who's going to get the right hand of God when you come into your power and your glory and your kingdom? You see, rather than reaching outward, what they've done to avoid what he's talking about is turn inward. Avoidance is a very nice skill. Denial works very well when you don't want to know the answers. What's in it for me? How do I protect myself? That may happen to you, Jesus, but I'm not so much about it. They turn inward and they shut down, denying the possibilities of the future and how they might be called to traverse them. Which really gets me to the point of asking the question regarding all the things that are going on in the world these days. Because there's a lot going on. And as things continue to occur, we have the same thing happen to us. There is that desire, as we see all the stuff going on in the world, there is that desire culturally to withdraw and protect, literally to build walls. Just shut down and we'll manage our own house, which is not unusual. Cultures and societies do this. The United States has done this. You read about President Wilson prior to World War I. When things are going on in Europe, he's not going to get involved. He's going to stay separate as long as he can. And we have this at other points where, we'll take care of our own. But the challenge is not to withdraw in fear, but to respond with good questions at this point, trying to determine not just what's happening, but we have to ask what's happening and what does it mean, and what does it mean to me as a person of faith? The migration we are seeing from the Middle East to Europe right now is of biblical proportions. It is of biblical proportions. But lest we forget, it is not something new. It is not something new. It may have gone over a longer period of time, but remember, Europeans fled to this land to avoid what? Tyranny and persecution. Same thing. My own ancestors fled Russia. They were Germans, but they fled Russia because they were being persecuted by the communists, and when they came to Ellis Island, if they couldn't get in, they jumped on another boat and went to South America and came in through Galveston. The exile of Jews changed the world when the temple was destroyed, the first time in 580 BC, and they were scattered around the Mediterranean region. It changed the world forever. And again in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, and again in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabel kicked them and then kicked the Muslims eventually out of Spain. It changed the world forever, and it must have been greatly unsettling. But what I submit to you in these kind of circumstances which are occurring, which are not new, what is required of us is not to shut down, not to have quick and easy answers, or to avoid that and say, okay, what is just about me, but to try to step back and say, where is God in all of this? Where are we as a people of God going to respond in all of this? Last spring we took an offering. We raised that $25,000, and I put in the blast this week some of the responses we got from Christians fleeing Syria into Turkey. And I've seen pictures now of the at least the safe areas that have been built for these people. So we have done at least a little, but there is much more to do. I am reminded of what the Pope recently said, challenging all the Catholic churches in Europe to take in one family to make a difference. And we say, well, what difference? Well, yeah, you're helping them, but think about it in a broader way. If Christians went into the Middle East, you would not be welcome there. That dialogue between Christian and Muslim would not take place in an open way, but a Muslim going into Europe flips that whole conversation around. all of a sudden Christians and Muslims can dialogue, and I have to ask myself, if that takes place, what does that mean? Where is God in that? And how would the world look if we did that? How would our faith be modeled then? And if so, what would be the difference? You know, God has a big view. Ours is much smaller. You know, we sometimes forget that the greatest growth in Christianity during the first century happened in Rome during the Black Plague. And I want you to stay with me on this. Because, now remember, Rome required 1 million slaves a year to keep their economy going. So Rome is conquering all these people and dragging them in, and they're of all kinds of different backgrounds and, multiple religions and faiths. And when the Black Plague hit, anybody who could afford to got in their RV and drove north. They left town. And who was in Rome? The poor people who couldn't escape, many of whom were Christian. And the Christians welcomed in these other people. And the world was changed and Christianity began to grow. In fact, Caligula, one of the greatest persecutors as a Roman Caesar of Christians, is quoted as saying, "Those Christians feed and clothe not only their own, but ours as well." So I am challenged as I look at all that's going on and trying to make sense of it and hearing all the anger and hostility and all that's going on. I have to take a deep breath and ask myself and pray, what's going on and where might God be in what's going on? And in light of that, what does it mean for me and for faith? How do I engage? How do I interact? How do I think? What are the questions I should be asking? For at the end of the day, I want you to think about this. At the end of the day, there's this dialogue going on with Jesus. And remember, I said Jesus doesn't give a lot of answers. So in response to some of the questions, who is the greatest? I'm going to die. What's this all mean? Jesus looks at the disciples, and what's he do? He walks over and he picks up a little child, and he places the child in the midst of them. Who asks more questions than a child? That is Jesus' answer. And it's good enough for me. Amen.